This is Archaeodeath, an exploration in the archaeology of death and memory, past and present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Recording in progress.
Welcome
Yeah.
to another Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guests.
Guests in plural with Archaeosoup and Archeo Michelle.
Yes, unverified.
Archeo Fujisan.
He is there.
Well, so thank you all for joining me for another Archaeodeath chat. And we're going to talk about contemporary death and deathscapes, aren't we? But it sounds like Michelle's got lots of questions from her admiring fans, admiring or demanding, because people don't ask questions. They demand answers on YouTube, don't they? They demand facts. So,
and if they don't have facts, they'll make them up and they'll tell you about it. Don't worry. Yeah, some people actually. So last time Howard was on, we talked about the history of mortuary practices and the general unalivement, since YouTube does not like the other word.
Does it not? Does it YouTube not like the use of the word to
exhume,
shove off one's mortal whatever?
Yes, it does. It doesn't like that word. Yes. So so you have to forgive us if we don't say it that much. But many people had questions about the differences in deathscapes, as Howard likes to put it. And so we've invited Mark to help us because this is something I don't know a lot about, and this is.
Sorry, go on. Don't let me interrupt
Oh,
you.
wonderful. Yeah, so every time we have to say the D word, Howard's just gonna lift that his little side.
Yeah, and you'll just hear a noise that goes, "Ahooga."
And so we were talking last time. Since we talked about the history of mortuary practices, we began at the beginning and we talked about caves. We even mentioned Neanderthal practices. So for both of you, what are the first burials that we actually have? Because we've got caves, but are those considered to be burials? Or something like Maze Howe, for example, are those considered to be burials, or are those considered to be a place where those who have passed on would go? Or are they sort of a living memory kind of thing?
So I suppose the point I would make is that a cave can be a tomb, but that contains graves. So, these are loose terms, and we can argue about them more. But for me, in practical terms, a grave is a cut into which body or bodies are deposited, that may be retrieved, may be circulated, but there is an act of one or more depositions into a feature. So a grave in formal archaeological terms is a cut feature, as opposed to a burial, which is the deposit that goes in a grave. And then a tomb is a loose term for a broader set of architectures, mausolea, but also natural features can be tombs or mausolea, including a cave. So the simple answer from my point of view is the burial is the dug feature into which a body or more than one bodies on more or more than one occasion are interred, as opposed to the burials and the tomb, catacomb, mausoleum, and various other terms we have for the structures, the architectures of death.
Very academic answer. Mark, do you have anything to add to that you would like to say?
I suppose that the only thing I would think to add is a little bit more wishy-washy, in so much as I think the way that people relate to these spaces, and I think you hinted at this in your question, Michelle, is important to consider. And again, I'm certain that Howard absolutely knows this. I'm not suggesting that he doesn't, but for example, the Neolithic context of the equivalent of a mausoleum or a tomb or a megalithic monument that we fairly casually say was in use for 1,000 years, something ridiculous like that. you know, and in many cases longer, but longer, for example, than say Durham Cathedral's been in use. It really indicates a relationship that could be religious, but also could actually be something which is much more of a social, oddly enough, much more actually day to day between the living and the dead. And it's something that I quite like getting, frankly, kids and students to think about, is whether or not young people back, for example, in the Neolithic, would have been scared of skeletons. And the answer is probably not. They probably saw bits of people floating around their homes all the time, you know, and so that relationship was ongoing potentially. And so having a set place might not be as simple as having a set place, as it were.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, that different societies have different relationships with the dead and different relationships with the place of the dead. And we've for many decades, archaeologists have tried to challenge, you know, some of the assumptions that come with the terminology we use. So if you're talking about a grave, you're not necessarily talking about a sealed, lost, removed from you know, human living interaction space. So a grave, or indeed a tomb, may be a space in which has other functions. It may be a place where bodies are placed and are kept, but it can also be a chapel. It can also be a temple. It could also be a meeting room. It could also be a place of a range of other rituals, including weddings or rites of initiation, or, you know, my point is that these labels only have a function to a certain degree, and then they become constrictions, they become problems. So when we're using them, we use them with an awareness that for different societies and times, cutting a space in which you deposit human remains, either articulated or disarticulated, having rotted or been processed elsewhere, boiled and mashed and put in a stew or whatever they do with them, that, you know, then they end up depositing them. That doesn't mean we use the term grave, but in many ways that that brings baggage. And so when you look at Maze How, and I want to answer the point about Maze How, you know, Neolithic archaeologists have spent a lot of time hand-wringing about calling them tombs, because, oh no, they're not just tombs, or they're not only tombs, they're more than tombs. But I would say that sets up a problem in itself, because it's suggesting that tomb or grave means the function of deposition only. And only if you believe that, then you're saying, well, they're not just that, we call them monuments. Well, okay, that's a neutral term, but it's so diffused that, you know, again, it's one of those things about who you're talking to and where. So if I'm in an academic conference of Neolithic specialists and I go, Maze How is a well-known tomb on Orkney, then someone's going to go, I think you may be assuming. But then if I'm talking to, which is a noise I've heard many a time, precisely that
comes out of tweed jackets. Yeah.
Yeah. ruffle, you know, harumph. So, but, you know, if I'm talking to a group of school kids, why not say a tomb implies architectural space above ground, or carved space under the ground? Either way, using the term tomb immediately sparks a connection with enclosed, protected, perhaps stone, doesn't have to be, you know, it implies built architectural spaces in which the dead exist. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the only thing they were for. So I'm less precious about this, because you have to think about, who am I talking to, and will they know what I mean?
So essentially it's a resting place, but it's an active resting place, and therefore it might be ritual.
Well, you know, well, no. Yes. So, I mean, you can use more neutral terms. So a lot of North American archaeologists that I know have used in the past phrases like mortuary facility, and you know, these kind of, and I understand that and I respect that, because what they're trying to do is avoid imposing modern expectations on that space. But honestly, you know, I've lost track of what they're talking about, you know, but on page one, it's like mortuary facility. What does that even mean? And then you see a picture and oh, you mean a burial mound? It's an earthen mound, right? Okay, I didn't know what that meant when you were talking about mortuary facilities. So, you know, and I'm supposed to be a specialist, and if I can't get it, then how's anyone else supposed to? So I think the point is, neutral terminology is great and gets us out of problems, but, you know, equally it shuts down access to those topics.
Isn't there also a potentially a little bit like for a long time in, for example, evolutionary anthropology, the idea of tool use being one of those things that it's no longer current thought, but one of those things that defined what we are. Burial has been one of those things, and for a lot of people for a long time, lots of academics even today, the idea that, for example, Neanderthals buried their dead is uncomfortable. But that said, though, we've got evidence, I believe, in South Africa of pre-Homo sapien hominins depositing the dead in out of the way places in caves. So I think one of them was described as a letterbox, basically just posting bones into an inaccessible chamber. So that deposition, that's a deliberate. And I know you were just making the case for it not always being removed, but in this instance, because we're talking about such an ancestral species to our own, even the act of having that concept is something which isn't unique to Homo sapiens, I would argue, anyway.
Well, I mean, I have mixed feelings about the Homo naledi debate, but I would say one of the things I flip between two, depending on mood, between the evidence isn't convincing enough yet, but then I flip and I tell them, this is the way I play with my students' brains, so they're too frazzled, they don't know what to think. Then I criticize it. Well, the evidence not convincing, could be water movement, all this stuff, and I build up the argument that maybe it's not burial. But then I say, why are we using the criteria of digging a pit into which depositing remains are then over? Why are we taking that, what we'd call in other contexts, primary burial, as the index of what equals mortuary practice, when so many societies up to recent times would, leaving the dead behind if you're nomadic, depositing the dead into caves and unretrievable spaces? Are you trying to say that they're more primitive than Homo naledi because they don't practice demonstrable evidence of digging a hole? That is ridiculous. My point is, we are setting up a silly set of criteria to prove a particular cognition that is mortuary practice, that somehow elevates that species or group to a level of refinement, when actually many of our societies in ethnographic examples wouldn't meet that criteria. And therefore you're actually creating a problem of the same old hierarchy of intellect versus practice. And in fact, if you want to take the argument, you could make the argument, and I'm not saying this, I'm just saying, if you took that to its ultimate exclusion, you could say that because we employ professionals at a variety of different levels, mortuaries, hospitals, undertakers, cemeteries, to do our disposal for us, we've lost that cognitive ability to care for the dead. And that would unsettle people even more. But if you're happy to use some tick box criteria for identifying which hominin species could rise so far as to dig a hole and dump some, what the hell are we doing? What is the game here? When actually there are many ways of disposing of the dead, and many of them don't involve burial at all.
Well, actually, you remind me of on the banks of the Danube, Lipensky Vir, that's it. The sort of the late Mesolithic, crossing into Neolithic, surrounded by farmers, but nonetheless continuing their own way of life, people on that riverbank, where you get old male burials beneath the hearth in these sort of vaguely trapezoidal, pyramidal sort of shaped houses, which seemingly are echoing the mountain across the river. So there's a lot. The people are very place rooted. They have a sense of who they are and where they are, very strong. But it was pointed out and suggested that, especially given their affinity for fish people, they have these little fish people statues, which are magnificent, that perhaps actually being the dry old man buried beneath the fire is not preferential. Perhaps preference is to be deposited into the whirlpool just off the riverbank. There was the confluence of waters creates this vortex, and so actually maybe the women, the young, they got to go and live with the fish people, and
I want to go live with the fish people.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and then you got yeah. Okay, sure. It could be a form of honoring them. What is that vortex?
Vortex.
Could be a form of honoring them, but perhaps also a form of uh, certainly restricting or having a preferential, non-preferential relationship between land burial and water deposition. You know,
That's really
it's,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, and in a natural landscape, features such as distinctive rock formations, caves, water features, the idea that you would, the choices you make about disposing of the dead could be deeply meaningful about location, timing, that don't involve digging a hole is my point. That's all I'm saying.
mm,
And so
mm,
and that's a brilliant example. Thank you, Mark. That
mm,
we don't know all the answers for the criteria of who is respected and who is not respected. But yes, exactly. And again, we are valorizing, or shall we say, putting on a pedestal a thing that is very Victorian, very, very, the idea of you have a permanent fixed tomb that is below the ground, sealed, and the only people go in there to slay vampires or to resurrect corpses and ask them questions, but normally that's not the done thing, or body
mm,
snatch, and it's very much, I mean, yes, I believe in honoring the dead and respecting the dead, and I'm not a total cultural relativist, but equally, the ethnographic and archaeological records show us so many ways in which we can care for and treat the dead that trying to just put digging a hole on as somehow the pinnacle of human achievement against which these species are judged seems a bit nonsense. And this, and as I said, I think we wouldn't, if you want to take it to the ultimate conclusion, it means that most global North societies have failed to meet that criteria because we don't do it ourselves.
Just one more thing though, weirder still is the weirdness of urban graves where you effectively long-term lease plots.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Because you lease
Yeah,
yourself for 100 years. That's right.
yeah, yeah. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be plucked out of the ground and replaced at the end of that 100 years, but it also means that your future is not certain
That's right.
in that place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where my grandfather is buried, one of my grandfathers anyway, is one of the oldest cemeteries in the United States. And when you go there, you see all of the tombstones are knocked over because there was nobody left to care for these things. And
Mm,
legally, they're not allowed to put somebody on top of them or move those graves without asking somebody who is still alive, where do you want this person to go?
mm,
So it's just, I mean, it's an incredible historical piece because you'll see graves from the 1700s, the 1800s there. That's how old many of these things are. And some of them are still legible. Some of the gravestones are
mhm.
still legible, but some of them are just not. And you have no way of knowing, toppled graves, people buried on top of each other, etc. It's very interesting.
Mm,
Just to see, like you say, it's a lease, but then there are
mm,
legal problems where they suddenly can't remove them because there's nobody to assign a lease somewhere else.
mm,
And so they just have to leave them there because they're knowing. As well, here in Canada, Howard and I talked last time, a very popular thing that people are doing now is they're asking for their remains to be cremated, but then put under a tree in a national park.
mhm,
And they're doing this because there is a law in Canada, at least in my province, where it says that if you know of human remains in a certain place that is considered to be a resting place, and you cannot then build housing property. I think it's 35, I can't remember if it's 35 feet or 35 yards around it. And so a lot of people are doing that to protect national parks, essentially, because then there's literally no way they can, because where we have a mass grave quite close. It's called we have the Walk of the Stone, and it's where 600 typhoid victims, Irish typhoid victims, are. And it's a parking lot. It's a Costco parking lot, and you could drive over, sit over there. And for years, people have been saying, "Hey, can we make this a memorial park?" Because there is a giant black stone that's there that says this is the resting place of typhoid victims. And as we talked about before we started recording, the whole concept of burying something 6 feet deep was to make sure that disease would not spread or that people would not be tempted to remove bodies that had disease in them. And so they
mhm,
buried them in the state, and then they covered it, and then the asphalt came over it eventually, and now it's a Costco parking lot. And so there are some people who don't care that their cars are parking over people who died here in the 1860s, but then there are some people going, "Hey, wait, what's that big giant stone? You mean this is a graveyard?" And so to that point, what actually is a graveyard then?
So Is that the next question? Well,
Yeah, so what is a graveyard versus a cemetery?
so in historical terms, a graveyard is a space which is a yard, a defined space for burial that is seen as distinctive from a cemetery, because a cemetery, focus please camera, cemetery is a larger municipal space. Graveyard has tended to be associated with non-conformist. Now, burial, in other words, the yard associated with a chapel that's not a church. So you have churchyard, which is you know, this is in British, from a British perspective. I don't know if this applies elsewhere. My understanding is that a churchyard is the traditional place of the Anglican post-Reformation community. A graveyard or a burial yard is associated with non-conformist chapels, and then a cemetery is the term that gets adopted for larger garden and then later private and then later municipal cemeteries from the Victorian age onwards. So you have these weird overlapping terms, and this matters a lot for historical archaeology and historical death studies more than it matters for anyone else. You know, I mean, so if you most times if you interspersed the terms cemetery, graveyard, burial site. In archaeological terms, though, if you're dealing with prehistoric or early historic sites, using graveyard just rings wrong. It just doesn't sound right, because it implies a historical context of association of a yard with a chapel. Or it doesn't have to have the chapel there. You can have a Quaker's burial ground, which would be called a graveyard, because it is a dedicated space with a wall. And we tend to talk about, in commercial archaeology, in academic archaeology, burial site or cemetery for archaeological finds, older archaeological finds, but cemetery also has a very specific modern era, you know, phenomenon of suburban, private, and then later taken over by civic authorities, a municipal cemetery, place for burial. So it's a bit messy, these terms. So, but in archaeologists who dig up stuff from all over the place, we could use graveyard, but we tend not to. Does that chime with what you think, Mark, or is that not what you thought?
No, I think that's absolutely spot on. To be honest, I'm still thinking about, and I wonder whether or not it relates to this question about defining yards, cemeteries, and defined burial spaces. Is the key thing that it's actually a place that is remembered as that place?
Yeah.
So, for example, Michelle was just talking about the Costco car park with the black stone. That immediately made me think of Sainsbury's in York.
I just thought the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if well, yes, you're aware of it. I don't know if you'll remember, Michelle, but I was locked out of a hotel overnight and took shelter in this car park. And yeah, it's a long story. It happened, I think, last September. But this car park, I knew it would be open because I used to live in York. But I went there and was just sort of about 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about this black stone again that was on the wall over, unfortunately, the site of the remains of the massacre of the Jewish population of York.
Oh yes.
And that is a car park, though, and of course they couldn't remove the remains for cultural and legal reasons. So instead, the act of memorializing them was seemingly enough. And I remember when I first learned about this, I thought that's kind of grim, isn't it? That's gross. But also at the same time, it's possibly good enough, and it is the best way of proceeding in this instance, because everyone who walks past, if they care to notice, they can notice. And perhaps maybe that's the. So, for example, in the case of the black stone in the Costco car park, is it presumably is there writing upon it? Can people?
It is huge. Yes, it is a very big thing. So if you like, I'll pull it up. So because it is, it's not like a plaque on a wall; it's a monument. And every year there is a ceremonial. The Irish community still does a ceremonial walk to the stone. I think it's every year in June, and it is enormous. So Montreal Black Stone. I'll read it to you. So here it is, the Irish commemorative stone. It has its own Wikipedia page, and it says, "To preserve from desecration the remains of good immigrants who died of ship fever from 1847 to 8." Sorry, that was 1860s. This stone, in caps, this stone is erected by the workmen of, and then it gives the old company that did it in a bunch of words, and then it says employed in the construction of the Victoria Bridge. So the Victoria Bridge was 1860. So the car park is here, and then there's the Victoria Bridge, which is down Victoria's, which is down one of the main streets. And when the bridge was erected, that's when they put up this giant stone. It's massive. You can't miss it. They called it ship fever, but it was typhoid. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very disconcerting, isn't it? And just two quick points of qualification. It was that the Dewberry Cemetery wasn't the massacre site. It was more the overall communal. It was the communal burial site for the community of Jewish community of York from somewhere between 1177, 1230, right up to the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. And the burials there showed some evidence of violence that is indicative of the medieval anti-Semitic dynamics at play. So there was confirmation, but then they balance that by saying actually Christian cemeteries at the same time also have evidence of lots of interpersonal violence. So it's difficult to pin down. We have we have the Norwich site, which is really grim, which is likely to be, I think it's Norwich, an actual murder site, actual killing site of Jewish people. But let's not go into that. But the point is, this stone, there was a massive controversy when the excavation took place, with different Jewish groups supporting and then finally opposing, and the excavations, because there was the indication they thought they didn't look Jewish according to modern Jewish criteria. So one Jewish group gave it the go ahead, and they're thinking, well, it must be Roman. There must be Roman burials, but they're not. They're medieval Jewish people, but a very controversial, rapid reburial. But yeah, that stone is still quite a small, humble, and poignant remembrance of a community that was lost, was expelled, and therefore it's quite uncanny in many ways, and also foreshadows, of course, much later history, and so therefore is very poignant. But the question is it a burial site now? No. It is at one level. It is. It's still, there are still graves. They didn't disturb all the graves. They were excavating the bits that weren't being disturbed by the car park.
Pile driving.
Yeah, pile driving. That's it, Mark. Yeah. So you've still got cemetery there. So at one level, its status is ambiguous. It was a burial ground. Is it now? Yes, it is. The burials are still there. Well, at least some of them are, but of course, it's not treated as that. So there's that past-present tension.
Mark had shared with me this week, speaking of medieval graves, Mark had shared this and I had a good laugh at it, because the headline says, this is an article from Popular Mechanics about a new discovery, and it says, archaeologists found a ship buried in Norway. It's older than the Vikings.
And I thought that was older than Stonehenge.
Well, I thought that was interesting, because we have ship burials that are older than the Vikings. So
there's this assumption that ship burial is something. So we know that ships are a metaphor of death and burial that go back in time. We have it as an important part of ancient Egyptian funerary culture, if not the burial of the ship. We certainly have the hint of it does happen on occasions. But in Northern Europe, we have ship burials going back to at least the late Roman Iron Age and migration period. But the particular tradition of ship inhumation that is particularly famous is really the earliest ones are Sutton Hoo, big ships, which is sort of early 7th century. But we're finding them in Western Norway now that are pushing back to near contemporary, so 8th century, perhaps late 7th century, and now the Estonia Salma ship burials, they're mid 8th century. So yeah, there's this weird thing that we associate ship burial with the Vikings or the Viking Age, whatever that means to people, but actually, of course, it's an older tradition. Both you bury the boat, you cremate the boat, and maybe they also did push the boat out and or burn the boat on water, but evidence for that isn't forthcoming.
What do you mean, Howard? The arrows, that didn't happen?
Yeah.
Valhalla.
Would you
My fingers are very cold. Have you ever tried to shoot arrows with cold fingers, as they say in
Yeah.
Norseman? Who boos a chieftain? It's really brilliant. Sorry, I
Have
digress.
you? Oh, no, I just remembered what you're talking. Yes. Yeah. Would you go so far as to extend that symbolism into sort of Iron Age log burials in the region? Because we know that people were using logs for canoes, weren't they?
That's a really good point. I don't know. I'll have to. I'm a bit sketchy on that off the top of my head.
Mm.
What I would say though is that we do, for all the boat burials, we have evidence of bits of boats being used in graves, bits of reused timbers used in houses from boats. So boats are going into houses, going into domestic furniture.
They make it sound like the boat kicks the door in.
Yeah,
I'm coming into the house.
Oh God, I thought you tied it up. No, I must have got loose again. No. So people are recycling bits of boats into furniture and house construction, and then it's going into the grave. So we actually have bits of clinker-built structure in graves that people are speculating, were they symbolically burying a bit of a boat, or were they actually using a casket that had been made from a bits of boat? And then you have the whole log dugout issue where we have, that's true, so we have anything that's a dugout log that could have been a boat, or was it a coffin? And there's a number of examples from as early as the Bronze Age right the way through to the early Middle Ages, the Quernmore burial, where you're wondering, is that two boats or is that just two bits of coffin, a top and a bottom that they've created to create a sealed container? So I'm a little sketchy on that. All I would say is that there's probably more boat symbolism and boat use, and then you have stone settings from the Bronze Age and the early Middle Ages made of boat shaped stone settings. There's probably more symbolism and uses of boats that we haven't fully confirmed, alongside the formal use of vessels as James Graham Campbell rather prosaically calls them, just big coffins, which is not exactly right, is it? But if that's one way you want to look at it, fine. Wealthy people get big coffins, they just use a boat. I think it's more than that, but yeah.
What can we say were the first coffins, though? Because technically, a coffin is just the way that it's shaped. A coffin versus a casket. There are different ways of it being shaped.
Yeah, so that's a whole other sort of definition slash debate that varies between North American archaeology and it's very much influenced by the modern funerary industry. I mean, so the idea is a coffin is anthropomorphic, whereas a casket is a modern funerary industry definition that I don't think makes any sense in the archaeological record. When we talk about a coffin, even in the archaeological record, there's debates about, is a coffin a definition for a transportable container in which you carried the body, or is it, when often we seem to be looking at, and this is true of my period of interest, early Anglo-Saxon graves, it's not clear this was ever a coffin you could carry. Is it more actually grave construction where you're putting in timbers and linings? And sometimes it's not at all clear. So there's a whole debate about terms and definitions and structures. Is this part of the grave structure, or is this something is it like a beer but a closed off beer where you're basically carrying the dead? And I'm a bit hazy on where the earliest coffins would come in that criteria, but we certainly have wooden containers from at least the Neolithic. I don't know if we've got any Mesolithic ones, but in Europe we do have deep time uses of timber structures, but sometimes that structure's in the grave to prepare for the body, as opposed to structures for carrying the dead or transporting the dead.
Yeah. I seem to recall the word coffin is related to the word basket. And you can give me that look all you want. I seem to recall.
I didn't give a look. I was thinking.
No, I'm looking at Michelle. Michelle, she doesn't trust me on word stuff. But
what do we say, Mark? What do we say?
I'm
William,
sorry.
William the Conqueror's exploding corpse, was that?
William the Conqueror's corpse.
It has the only relation is that a coffin comes from the Latin coffinus, which means a type of hamper. That it is the same idea, but the word basket does not come from.
Okay, but nonetheless, it's a container which is portable into which you put things, if that's what I mean. So, whereas actually, as you say, the idea of having in that sense, I wonder what's the crossover between a site which is effectively lined as a prepared space and a tomb. Yeah, there's a grey area there as well, I suppose. I guess. I mean, would a tomb have to be covered over, perhaps?
You see, this is a language thing. So French archaeologists would use tomb to be a grave, as far as I understand it from excavation reports. But I would never use tomb to refer to an earth-cut grave.
No.
So
No.
you know, it's. I mean, and the other one that I love, and there's two others that I love actually that I don't make sense but do, and the arcane terms like necropolis. And necropolis, for me, is a really good term because it gives a sense of a city of the
city
dead.
of the dead, yeah.
A large cemetery. And of course, across Europe, many languages will use necropoli, whatever you want to call it, necropolis, as a term for large cemetery. And they'll apply it to medieval, ancient, prehistoric. I don't understand the English language reluctance to use that term because I find it a very evocative term to refer to a long-term, architecturally impressive, complex funerary space. But no one likes to use it in Britain. The other one that I find particularly in Scandinavian languages, and I've encountered it most in Sweden, is gravefield as an English translation for because in a field of graves, a gravfält is the term used, at least in Swedish. I don't know about the other Scandinavian Nordic languages, but for Iron Age cemeteries and you know, and it makes sense. It's a field, it's not bounded. And for me, that's quite a liberated term because it gives a sense of an open space where funerals and other rituals, doesn't have to be exclusive funerals, take place. And so when I see signs for it and I see it on heritage signs, I immediately translate it into English as gravefield, and it locates geographically. I'd never use that in Britain, but I would never correct a Scandinavian for saying that because it does make absolute sense to the morphology, the topography of what they're referring to. It is the cemetery or necropoli have more built, defined associations, more
bounded.
More. And so I like some of these terms, even if they are just a little bit sketchy in use, because they just, you know, we should be a little bit playful and versatile in our use of terms, if only because I've written in so many research articles the same bleeding words. I want a bit of a change, and so I like people tell me off for using cinerary urn, and I love talking about cinerary urns as a vessel used to contain the cremated remains of the dead, because if I have to put cremation burial, cremation urn all the bleeding time throughout an article, just have a bit of variety. Cinerary urn, I love it. It's got a nice feel to it. It has a sort of gravelly texture of like gets between your teeth.
I have actually heard necropolis, but specifically for cemeteries that don't only contain graves, for cemeteries that have things like ossuaries, mausoleums, all the everything in between, to essentially conjure the idea of this is not just a cemetery where people lie, but also there are other buildings that have the dead in them.
And I suppose there's another term. Mausoleum tends to be above ground, but doesn't have to be. A mortuary facility for multiple interments, usually architectural. Columbarium is another one for cremated remains after a pigeon house, you know, but the idea of niches, as in the ancient Roman columbaria, are basically above ground niches where you could have inhumations too, but you have, you know, above ground repositories for the cremated dead, and they look like dovecotes, you know, pigeon houses. So I like these terms, and I've seen things called columbaria in the funerary industry for anything above ground that's for the deposition of cremated remains. And so columbaria can be anything, but it implies above ground accessible funerary spaces. So the terms are really fluctuating. And ossuary, again, I would use ossuary to refer to a collection of exhumed remains. So they've been buried, the flesh has rotted away, you exhume them and put the remains together into an ossuary, and that, you know, so that would be what I would call a bone house. So these but
an ossuary is so romantic. It's like the bones have been put together going, oh hello, and then they just live together for the rest of their lives. Because sometimes, you know, when you have ossuaries, you're not sure whose remains they are. So, you know, to me it's very nice because you're giving them somebody to live with for the rest of their unlife, instead of just,
Mm.
you know, a femur there, a femur here. You know, you're playing matchmaker to, to these bones that would otherwise have no home. And I think that's quite romantic. But I'm dark. What can I say? The one thing I wanted to mention is that we keep talking about graves as burials, or that they have some kind of remains or something in them, but there are plenty of other types of graves or monuments that don't have anything in them at all, right? So like cenotaphs we talked briefly about last time, unknown graves, like we have no idea where people like Genghis Khan or Anthony Cleopatra, well, we kind of know where they are, we can't get to it, but we have no idea where they are, or even fake graves like King Arthur's grave at Glastonbury. You know, we know that's not real, but people still visit it like it's real. So are those graves? Are those burials?
Yeah, I mean, but they're mortuary sites.
But are they mortuary sites if there's nobody unalived in them?
Okay, well, let me be pedantic and say that at least according to the story of the monks of Glastonbury Abbey, they found skeletons. It just might not be this. They may not be the grave of King Arthur, but it's a burial site. You know, I think they're probably Bronze
But
Age.
did they though, Howard? Did they? Because there was a very suspicious fire before that happened, and oh my gosh, they certainly needed money to rebuild the abbey.
They definitely convincingly found that, and Guinevere, the second wife, according to Gerald of Wales, was, you know, buried with him. I mean, why? And her hair, you know, her hair.
Yes, the golden hair that survived
because of the perverse thoughts of the monk who touched it or something. And you know, this is very convincing. This is very convincing, Michelle. No, but you know, we don't know for sure. I mean, it could be a parable, but bones were deployed. Someone's bone.
Oh no, not Jerry.
Jerry. How did you have that just there? How did that?
Because this is one of my favourite childhood books, Gerald's Wales by Cadw. It has an amazing map. It's
wonderful! That is an amazing map. I want this now.
But I think Howard, I think you meant Jeff, our good buddy Jeff, because I mean Gerald of Wales is another liar, but
Jerry and Jeff.
But Jeff is Geoffrey of Monmouth is our marker, Imaginist.
So in literary terms, like Stonehenge, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, is a burial site of the kings of Britain. But it happens to be a burial site affirmed by archaeological evidence. But in the literary context of his writings, he imagined it to be a burial site. So it's a burial site. But it's not. Doesn't mean that it was. You know, it's just that in the context of his writing, it's a burial site.
Is it inappropriate to go to a place and assign it a legendary character such as King Arthur?
Oh yeah.
And the reason why I say that is are we getting to? Do you get to a point in these conversations where actually saying that is inappropriate is itself sort of disrespectful to the cultural creation that is the Glastonbury tour? Or another sort of linked question that's come up in this way of thinking about that is I'm reminded of an ancient practice in Egypt of when people went traveling, they would take a small statue of themselves, because the actual expense of some people would anyway, the actual expense of traveling back, or whether or not your body might perish in death, might mean that you wouldn't be able to return the remains to the family. So actually these little mannequins, these little statues, actually more like, could take on the personage, as it were, of the deceased and be buried in their stead. So I suppose you can sort of increasingly abstract in that sense, can't you? Whether or not there's a body there, whether or not there's a person identified with that place, or whether or not that place is simply a place that we identify with a person, you know.
Well, that's why I was being deliberately vague, but I did it with a reason to call it a mortuary site, a site connected to a story or practice of death. I mean, part of these will be cenotaphs. So you have the idea of the cenotaph is the grave without the body, and so you have this idea that the grave. you have the grave without the body surviving. So it's I can't beat a dragon. Sorry, you beat me with that. So you could have the so you could have like the tomb of the unknown soldier. Has a single tomb, but it stands for other tombs, and then you have. But that's not really a cenotaph. But then you have a cenotaph is a tomb that stands for sites other places and other locations where the dead are. And of course, with some of the holy dead, we have relics. You have it somewhere between the fully absent dead and the relic, which stands for the holiness and the presence of the dead, whether it is a part of their body or something that touched their body. So you have this complex nexus of mortuary associations, but you wouldn't necessarily call a reliquary that contains a fragment of cloth a tomb, but you would call it. You wouldn't even call it a cenotaph because it's not even implying the whole body. So you have this kind of my brain is I'm confused now. But the point is, there's many mortuary sites that don't have bodies.
Yeah.
It's a representation of the life of a person, or you could say.
I think that's very true.
Yeah.
So these terms are messy, and sometimes we're not even sure whether and the other thing is many burials have fragments of people, not only fragments of whole bodies, but most of the cremations we find, there are fragments. They seem to be, sometimes we have problems with knowing whether there was originally more and it's just the acidic soil or the disturbance. But in some cases, as Jackie McKinley talks about for, say, the West Hampnet, Sussex site, where she's basically saying that it looks like in the Iron Age they were literally taking a handful of bone from the pyre, and that's going into the grave. And who are we to say it's not a grave or not a burial? Maybe that was simply seen as enough, and we get into this whole, tangle of our expectations of what is a burial versus what people in the past thought was appropriate. We only have to retrieve a handful of bone in our culture. So
a handful of bone. Howard. I thought I was in there before Mark because I knew he was going to do it.
Actually, I was being far more respectful, seeing as this is Howard's
fistful of
channel.
To your point, Howard. I mean, even Victorian times, memento mori were a thing.
Yeah.
And so even and Percy Bysshe and Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe weren't even together at that point because he had already cheated on her. But when he forgot that he could not swim and then drowned, his remains were on the beach for quite some time, and they had, because he was decomposing, they had to cremate him then and there. And then people took pieces of him after he was cremated. It was perfectly fine to do so. And then she kept a piece of him in her drawer her whole life. Is the drawer a resting place? No. Is it?
Well,
is it?
Well, it ended up in her tomb. So in St. Peter's in Bournemouth. So her tomb contains what was alleged to be the heart, but we don't think it was the heart. There's a whole, of Shelley, and so you have, but it's a tomb of her parents, her brother, or is it somebody else? And anyway, her and other members of the family. So it's a collective tomb, a family grave, a tomb, if you like. And his element, part of him is there, and he's
his element.
I think he was probably trying to get GPT to tell him how to swim, and you go, okay, Google, swimming, and like these adverts were constantly pumped onto us all the time. And, use your, immediately have a website, immediately learn how to swim. So I think we'll probably find that most of these people were time travelers, but fecklessly relying on AI and dying in the past because they didn't realize when they went back to the 18th century or the 5th century, they didn't they couldn't outsource their wisdom to some. Sorry, that's just me rambling. That's nothing to do with what we're talking about. Sorry, that was just a complete. I feel overdosed by the number of adverts I have attacking me about the need to completely AI upgrade my life, and I just don't want to. Humbug, I say.
I have a thought and question, and that is the practicalities that sometimes are forced upon people when they are in the presence of death. So Michelle just talked about the need to cremate the remains before they turned too much, presumably on a very sunny beach. But also in times of war, in times of emergency, in times of being stranded, in times also of being alone. I can't quite recall. It was a couple of years ago now that there was a man in the Amazon whose family had been attacked by loggers when he was a child, and he enacted for himself upon his death, because people were more or less leaving him to be isolated for his own good. But he enacted a ritual for himself. He covered himself in feathers as he knew he was dying, and was found, obviously after the fact, in this situation, in this position. And I sort of find myself wondering, given that he was so young, and of course everyone learns something about death quite early on. We learn something about where the dead go, or whatever. But I wonder whether actually almost anything of significance is actually good enough. I suppose what I'm saying is, what you see there is potentially a ritual, but also potentially just a conscious being intuiting how to die. And you hear about people doing what they can, saying what they can. I don't know the words. You often see people in TV dramas say, and yet actually those moments become significant through the intention of them being so. Do you have any thoughts on this, do you think?
Kind of auto funeral.
Well, auto funeral, or sort of something which is especially, for example, given that we've identified that one of the issues in talking about this stuff is this essentially Eurocentrism. There's this idea of, a burial is 6 foot deep. It has to have a gravestone. It has to the coffin, the blah blah blah. Whereas actually, when deprived of that stuff, people still manage, don't they? They still, even if they want it, they do something else.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you could. There's a whole very sensitive area I don't want to spend too much time on, about Western ideas about suicide, and and how can you say farewell to yourself, and like euthanasia debates, and are you is that a ritual if you are making those choices? You have the saga literature of the Viking that would go out, of the Scandinavian that would go out on a boat that he knew was poorly equipped for the seas of the winter or whatever it may be, and therefore he's kind of committing an act of, or you have the sort of death by Viking, death by cop. You put yourself in a position where you get into so many arguments with people that you're going to be exiled, and if you're exiled, then there's a whole series of questions of where we draw the parameters for these kind of behaviors. And I find, even for me, the poem Beowulf, the Old English poem with the last survivor, this imagined last survivor of an ancient people who is the last one to put all the treasures into the burial mound that the dragon then later comes to guard. And it's often been described by those that know as a funeral, but I've actually argued in a piece of writing I did a while ago that it's actually kind of an anti-funeral, because if you're the last person and you're not even saying goodbye with a body or your own body, you're saying goodbye with things to that entire people that have gone. And I'm fascinated with that, because people have made the assumption that the tomb that in which the dragon's guarding is perceived to be a grave, a tomb. And I've said that's my argument is that's a modern archaeological assumption. Early medieval people may have had a different understanding of an ancient chamber filled with treasure, guarded by a dragon, and in which an ancient people had given away the last of their treasures. And it's literally, as described, it's a treasury. It's not a tomb. And why? But everyone, because they think, oh, well, it's clearly inspired by Neolithic megalithic architecture, and we know they were tombs. I go, hang on, no, whoa. The logic here is not a bit right. Yeah. We know there were tombs, do we? Therefore, early medieval people would have encountered them, thought they were tombs, to fulfill our knowledge of the fact that they're tombs. When actually, as we said earlier, many Neolithic scholars now balk at the idea of describing them as tombs anyway. So what are we doing? So we've created this, and many of the medieval scholars have bought into this because they rely on archaeologists who apparently know what they're talking about, and obviously not in this case. So I would make the contention that what is being described here is the last items added to a treasury as the ultimate sorrow when there's no funeral to be had. There's nobody left to hold a. It's a kind of anti-funeral on multiple levels because there's no bodies and there's no group. And so what you're actually it's actually supposed to be horrific for a early medieval audience who demand honor and remembrance by a kin group. The idea if you're lost without anyone left and you have to, is the ultimate horror, and at least one of the ultimate horrors. So for me, I find that's really interesting how we get ourselves in loops and confusions over these things when actually that's a really evocative, disturbing moment. And I think the lack of bodies, absence of bodies, and trying to commit funerals for people without bodies isn't always universally anxiety ridden, but it can be incredibly confusing. Are they dead? Are they coming back? And what do you do once they come back? Do you just go, oh, we were wrong? Most of the time, I think in most societies, it's like, we've already done the funeral, man. It's a bit rude, you coming back to life. No, I was just having a sleep. I'm sorry, you're clearly a devil now. We're going to kill you because you're possessed by evil.
Are you thinking Highlander?
I was actually thinking of some genuine ethnographic examples.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Of the world. but also, actually, that's true. It is. That's Highlanders does the same thing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They can't.
Connor MacLeod was my kinsman. I don't know who you are.
That's it.
For goodness sake.
Totally forgot about that.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I blame Kurgan, actually. Clancy Brown, he's behind most of the problems of the world.
But actually, there's an interesting thing there implied in that film, and I could talk about the cinematography of that movie all day, but we're not here to talk about that. But in that film, there's this interesting thing that because someone essentially has not performed their death, they've been so rude as to not, as you say, stay dead, that people don't know what the heck to do with it. It's a ritual which isn't designed to have. It's a one-way valve. You're not meant to come back the other way. Yeah.
It's the whole. So it's the funeral equivalent to going, right, I'm leaving now. I'm sick of all of you, and you storm out the door and go, I just left my hat. Can I just come back in? Sort of like, no, you're not supposed to come back in. Everyone's sort of really embarrassed.
Exactly. No, we've already eulogized you. We're not doing it again. We paid. We paid already.
Can you imagine if Elrond goes, Elrond and Galadriel and Bilbo come, sorry, actually, hobbits, we did forget, and Gandalf, we were going to go over the horizon to the Undying Lands, but I forgot my coffee maker, something like that. Just snuck around to the next cove and just sort of went back all the way to Rivendell to get.
Or the person comes back and goes, I didn't really like that. Could you do it again? Could we have another go?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I suppose, this is turning into just an unjustifiable ramble, but I think there are many problems of parameters and definitions that we've got to sit with rather than try and dismiss, and that they help us to think about how past people had messy, anxious decisions to make about when to call death, when to, if you're far away from home, do you boil up the remains just as a panic, just to get the bones back, or do you do a temporary burial and take a memento back, and then you have a funeral for the memento? Or how do you deal with the unexpected, burial at sea, burial in circumstances that are unclear, murder, lightning strikes, and all sorts of weird things that people have to contend with. Well, how did that person die? They were literally here, and now they're just a crisp, smouldering pile of, what do we do now? That doesn't really fit. And so I think there's all those anxieties over unusual choices and unexpected, and it's all being done this is the thing, we try and treat it as abstract, but it's all being done at a fast pace without people consulting a big book of death of what to do in circumstances of being run over by a railway train and then flattened by a herd of wildebeest. There's nothing in the book. What do we do? So you have to. It's all winging it at the end of the day. It's all being sort of under time pressure. People just making the best choices with what's available.
I wonder what will happen when the first person dies off planet.
Oh, definitely cremated and shipped into the great beyond.
Kind of like burial at sea. No, sorry, I'm not just off that. So I mean on another planet, so on the moon, perhaps.
Oh,
If that's what I mean. I
Moon's not a
wonder if
planet, Mark.
it's
It's a moon.
it's
It's a moon.
on
It's a
another
moon.
body,
It's a moon.
another
It's a moon.
body.
so well, I mean, sci-fi's already imagined this, and this is one of the things I find really intriguing about science fiction is how funeral, and not just science fiction in outer space, but I was, rereading Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues, and the crew of the Nautilus have funerals amongst seaweed at a very designated spot, and they are taking the dead, thousands of miles, leagues, to that specific spot, and they've created a cemetery under the water. And likewise, almost all sci-fi is that pioneering frontier anxiety about what to do with the dead and the loss of the dead. So there's lots of, when we get to unusual circumstances, mountaineering, deep sea exploration, outer space, you have a lot of real interesting, rich literary plays on what do you do in those circumstances. And so yes, you have the pile of rocks and a flag, there's always a version, or you have the jettison into space if you're still in space version. There's lots of interesting things there, but we haven't had it yet. But I think what they probably do, they must, knowing NASA and other organizations, they probably have very precise procedures of what should be done. They must have a manual. Come on, I can't believe that the International Space Station didn't have a manual for what to do if someone dies. I mean, they must have had a.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. They
They
must
do.
have how healthy they were.
They do.
Yeah.
They actually have protocol. They even, when the Artemis went up a couple of weeks ago, they showed how they would do things like CPR in space. So they do have protocol.
Right.
They do know.
Yeah. But it's unlikely, but it's not that unlikely that someone might pass away, and then what do you do with them? I mean, obviously the answer is to get a roadster, a Tesla roadster, and then and just stick them in it and push them out. But they're not always available, apparently.
No. Yeah.
With a copy of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because it's funny.
Yeah,
according to
when
Elon Musk.
you write across the roadster, don't panic.
Yeah, it's really funny because it's Elon's humor.
Mm.
Make comedy legal again.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah.
And that has been an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guests.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the Archaeodeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.